Turning our attention over to the markets now. Earlier in the week, we were joined by UNL Livestock Marketing and Risk Management Specialist Elliot Dennis. As we like to do, we had the chance to ask Elliot about the cattle markets, but we began the discussion by getting an update on highly pathogenic avian influenza, or HPAI. Joining us today is Elliot Dennis, UNL Livestock Market Economist. Elliot, it's great to have you back here on Market Journal. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Let's begin today's conversation discussing highly pathogenic avian influenza. We've talked about this for quite some time now, and it seems like the headlines are not quite going away just yet. What can you share with our viewers?
Yeah, well, it's continued to go up since we've talked about it pretty much every time. We were at about 45 million in the summer, and now we're peaked at a little bit over 50 million. And we look at kind of the distribution of where this is happening. We're seeing it happen a lot in egg layers. So not surprisingly, Iowa and Nebraska are some of the largest states that are hit by this. I think when we look at total impact, Iowa is about 30% of all that production of the damage impacts, and Nebraska is about 10%. We add in Turkey with Minnesota, and we're pretty much at about 70% on the top 5 states. So it is still here, and some states are having a greater impact than others. And it's really, ultimately, it's affecting the price that we're going to pay for eggs, for chicken, and for turkeys, particularly around Thanksgiving.
Yeah, Turkey Day is coming up.
Yeah.
Consumers are going to notice a price there, or just maybe chalk it up as inflation this year. Is it going to be noticeable?
There is a little bit due to inflation, but there is about a 30% increase over the last year, and a lot of that has to do with kind of the high path depopulation that's been happening in the turkey population. So we should expect some higher prices. I think that 16 to 24 pound should be around that 185 range per pound.
We'll definitely keep an eye on that. Elliot, let's switch up this conversation, talk about the cattle markets. Here in the month of November, what are you seeing big picture there?
Yeah, I think that the big thing is that we're seeing elevated fed cattle weights still. I mean, we're looking at the fed steer that's being harvested. It's around 930 pound dressed. And so that's considerably higher than we would expect at this time. But when slaughter weights go up, we tend to see that drop in price. We're still pretty much on an upswing on a lot of this price. We're at about the 152 live weight range, or live, and about 240 on the dressed carcass. And so I think even though we're having some difficulty in the market, prices are still kind of rising. The thing that I'm most concerned about, and I'm looking, is we tend to be pretty front heavy right now, particularly here in Nebraska. We've pulled a lot of cattle forward given where we're at in the drought. And so where we actually go forward into 2023 and into 2024 as far as beef production kind of remains to be seen.
Did you bring your crystal ball to tell us, are those high prices here to stick around for a little bit longer?
Fortunately, it broke on the way over here, so I won't be able to provide that.
Well, a couple other things that have been happening. The meat packers came together, I understand. You can share some details on this, but they came together and committed to lowering their emissions. What can you share with the viewers?
Yeah, so basically a big summit's going on over in the Middle East right now. All the global community is getting together and they're talking about methane emissions. And really what they're talking about is where do we need to get to by 2030? And really the meat processing industry is committed to reduce methane emissions. Global standards are about 30% reduction by 2030. And so NAMI, which is the North American Meat Animal Institute, which represents about 90% of all the red meat production, has basically committed to reduce methane emissions. This is kind of a larger trend within the industry to kind of show what is the animal agriculture, what are we doing to reduce emissions. And particularly when we talk about methane, which tends to be short-lived, basically 10 years, but more volatile than, let's say, CO2. I think the cattle industry and even other livestock industries have the ability to really lead forward in this space and show that not only are we reducing, but we're also maybe even sequestering more carbon than we're releasing.
We've talked about cattle prices hit on the packers just now, and I want to make sure I ask you if you've been seeing any data or things you can share with us when it comes to consumers' reaction to the price of beef. There's always a lot of chatter out there. Is the consumer going to stop buying beef because of some of these higher prices? What's the data show?
Yeah, so when we're talking about consumer demand, we always have to consider it's not quantity consumed, it's always a price and a quantity together. And probably the biggest information out there is the Meat Demand Monitor out of K-State. They produce monthly consumer estimates on this. And what we've really shown over the last 3 to 6 months is that people's willingness to pay or how much they want to purchase an item for hasn't really changed across the primary commodities, ground beef, ribeye, chicken breast. And so that hasn't changed a lot. And when we're talking about the values that they use in there, it hasn't really changed. People are still valuing taste, preference, of course, quality, and price. And so that's a good sign that people are being robust. However, in their kind of monthly report, they do provide some unique questions that are specific to a given month. This past October, they asked, how are you adjusting to inflation? And really, people aren't substituting like we would normally see between, let's say, beef and pork and chicken. Really what we're seeing them do is just buy less of the item they prefer. And so they're buying fewer quantity or they're buying smaller packages. So someone who likes beef is going to continue to buy beef. They're just going to buy less of it. So that's kind of the way people are really adapting to inflation as far as consuming animal protein.
Well, as we wrap today's conversation up, Elliot, hard to believe, but we are about ready to put a bow on 2022. As we do so, for our cattle producers in particular today, what kind of considerations should they be maybe thinking about this time of year?
Yeah, so this year has really been kind of crazy when we think about kind of the herd liquidation that's been happening, ongoing drought considerations. So for people who have considered or have sold cattle throughout this year, I think getting together with the tax consultant can really be beneficial and your accountant to kind of see where you're at. Though it's going to be a larger consideration potentially this year than it has been in the past. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but we just want to make sure that we're set up financially going into 2023.
Some good thoughts. Elliot, appreciate your time.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Bryce.